Chapter 45. There are moments when, in connection with the sensitively imaginative or morbidly anachronistic, the mentality assailed and the same not of any great strength and the problem confronting it of sufficient force and complexity, the reason not actually toppling from its throne, still totters or is warped or shaken, the mind befuddled to the extent that for the time being, at least, unreason or disorder and mistaken or erroneous counsel would appear to hold against all else. In such instances the will and the courage confronted by some great difficulty which it can neither master nor endure, appears in some to recede in precipitate flight, leaving only panic and temporary unreason in its wake. And in this instance, the mind of Clyde might well have been compared to a small and routed army in full flight before a major one. Yet at various times in its precipitate departure, pausing for a moment to meditate on some way of escaping complete destruction and in the coincident panic of such a state, resorting to the weirdest and most haphazard of schemes of escaping from an impending and yet wholly unescapable fate. The strained and bedeviled look in his eyes at moments, the manner in which, from moment to moment and hour to hour, he went over and over his hitherto poorly balanced actions and thoughts but with no smallest door of escape anywhere. And yet again at moments the solution suggested by the item in the Times Union again thrusting itself forward, psychogenetically, born of his own turbulent, eager and disappointed seeking. And hence persisting. Indeed, it was now as though from the depths of some lower or higher world never before guessed or plumbed by him. A region otherwhere than in life or death and peopled by creatures otherwise than himself. There had now suddenly appeared, as the genie at the accidental rubbing of Aladdin's lamp, as the effort emerging as smoke from the mystic jar in the net of the fisherman, the very substance of some leering and diabolic wish or wisdom concealed in his own nature, and that now abhorrent and yet compelling, leering and yet intriguing, friendly and yet cruel, offered him a choice between an evil which threatened to destroy him, and against his deepest opposition, and a second evil which, however it might disgust or sear or terrify, still provided for freedom and success and love. Indeed, the center or mentating section of his brain at this time might well have been compared to a sealed and silent hall in which alone and undisturbed, and that in spite of himself, he now sat thinking on the mystic or evil and terrifying desires or advice of some darker or primordial and unregenerate nature of his own, and without the power to drive the same forth or himself to decamp, and yet also without the courage to act upon anything. For now the genie of his darkest and weakest side was speaking. And it said, "And would you escape from the demands of Roberta that but now and unto this hour have appeared unescapable to you? Behold! I bring you away. It is the way of the lake, Pass Lake. This item that you have read, do you think it was placed in your hands for nothing? Remember Big Bittern, the deep, blue-black water, the island to the south, the lone road to 3 Mile Bay? How suitable to your needs. A rowboat or a canoe upset in such a lake and Roberta would pass forever from your life. She cannot swim. The lake, that you have seen, that I have shown you, is it not ideal for the purpose? So removed and so little frequented and yet comparatively near, but 100 miles from here. And how easy for you and Roberta to go there, not directly but indirectly, on this purely imaginative marriage trip that you have already agreed to. And all that you need do now is to change your name, and hers, or let her keep her own and you use yours. You have never permitted her to speak of you and this relationship, and she never has. You have written her but formal notes. And now if you should meet her somewhere as you have already agreed to, and without anyone seeing you, you might travel with her, as in the past to Fonda, to Big Bittern, or some point near there. But there is no hotel at Big Bittern, at once corrected Clyde. A mere shack that entertains but few people and that not very well. All the better. The less people are likely to be there. But we might be seen on the train going up together. I would be identified as having been with her. Were you seen at Fonda, Gloversville, Little Falls? Have you not ridden in separate cars or seats before and could you not do so now? Is it not presumably to be a secret marriage? Then why not a secret honeymoon? True enough, true enough. And once you have arranged for that and arrive at Big Bittern or some lake like it, there are so many there, how easy to row out on such a lake. No questions. No registry under your own name or hers. A boat rented for an hour or half day or day. You saw the island far to the south on that lone lake. Is it not beautiful? It is well worth seeing. Why should you not go there on such a pleasure trip before marriage? Would she not be happy so to do, as weary and distressed as she is now, an outing, a rest before the ordeal of the new life? Is not that sensible, plausible? And neither of you will ever return presumably. You will both be drowned, will you not? Who is to see? A guide or two, the man who rents you the boat, the innkeeper once, as you go. But how are they to know who you are? Or who she is? And you heard the depth of the water. But I do not want to kill her. I do not want to kill her. I do not want to injure her in any way. If she will but let me go and she go her own way, I will be so glad and so happy never to see her more. But she will not let you go or go her way unless you accompany her. And if you go yours, it will be without Sandra and all that she represents, as well as all this pleasant life here, your standing with your uncle, his friends, their cars, the dances, visits to the lodges on the lakes. And what then? A small job. Small pay. Another such period of wandering as followed that accident at Kansas City. Never another chance like this anywhere. Do you prefer that? But might there not be some accident here, destroying all my dreams, my future, as there was in Kansas City? An accident, to be sure, but not the same. In this instance the plan is in your hands. You can arrange it all as you will. And how easy. So many boats upsetting every summer, the occupants of them drowning, because in most cases they cannot swim. And will it ever be known whether the man who was with Roberta Alden on Big Bittern could swim? And of all deaths, drowning is the easiest, no noise, no outcry, perhaps the accidental blow of an oar, the side of a boat. And then silence. Freedom, a body that no one may ever find. Or if found and identified, will it not be easy, if you but trouble to plan, to make it appear that you were elsewhere, visiting at one of the other lakes before you decided to go to 12th Lake? What is wrong with it? Where is the flaw? But assuming that I should upset the boat and that she should not drown, then what? Should cling to it, cry out, be saved and relate afterward that. But no, I cannot do that, will not do it. I will not hit her. That would be too terrible. Too vile. But a little blow, any little blow under such circumstances would be sufficient to confuse and complete her undoing. Sad, yes, but she has an opportunity to go her own way, has she not? And she will not, nor let you go yours. Well, then, is this so terribly unfair? And do not forget that afterwards there is Sandra, the beautiful, a home with her in Lycurgus, wealth, a high position such as elsewhere you may never obtain again, never, never. Love and happiness, the equal of anyone here, superior even to your cousin Gilbert. The voice ceased temporarily, trailing off into shadow, silence, dreams. And Clyde, contemplating all that had been said, was still unconvinced. Darker fears or better impulses supplanted the counsel of the voice in the great hall. But presently, thinking of Sandra and all that she represented, and then of Roberta, the dark personality would as suddenly and swiftly return, and with amplified suavity and subtlety. Ah, still thinking on the matter. And you have not found a way out, and you will not. I have truly pointed out to you and in all helpfulness the only way, it is a long lake. And would it not be easy in rowing about to eventually find some secluded spot, some invisible nook near that south shore where the water is deep? And from there how easy to walk through the woods to 3 Mile Bay and Upper Gray's Lake? And from there to the Cranstons? There is a boat from there, as you know. Pa, how cowardly, how lacking in courage to win the thing that above all things you desire, beauty, wealth, position, the solution of your every material and spiritual desire. And with poverty, commonplace, hard and poor work as the alternative to all this. But you must choose. And then act. You must. You must. You must. Thus the voice in parting, echoing from some remote part of the enormous chamber. And Clyde, listening at first with horror and in terror, later with a detached and philosophic calm as one who, entirely apart from what he may think or do, is still entitled to consider even the wildest and most desperate proposals for his release, at last, because of his own mental and material weakness before pleasures and dreams which he could not bring himself to forego, psychically intrigued to the point where he was beginning to think that it might be possible. Why not? Was it not even as the voice said, a possible and plausible way, all his desires and dreams to be made real by this one evil thing? Yet in his case, because of flaws and weaknesses in his own unstable and highly variable will, the problem was not to be solved by thinking thus, then, nor for the next 10 days for that matter. He could not really act on such a matter for himself and would not. It remained as usual for him to be forced either to act or to abandon this most wild and terrible thought. Yet during this time a series of letters, 7 from Roberta, 5 from Sandra, in which in somber tones insofar as Roberta was concerned, in gay and colorful ones in those which came from Sandra, was painted the now so sharply contrasting phases of the black rebus which lay before him. To Roberta's pleadings, argumentative and threatening as they were, Clyde did not trust himself to reply, not even by telephone. For now he reasoned that to answer would be only to lure Roberta to her doom, or to the attempted drastic conclusion of his difficulties as outlined by the tragedy at Pass Lake. At the same time, in several notes addressed to Sandra, he gave vent to the most impassioned declarations of love, his darling, his wonder girl, how eager he was to be at 12th Lake by the morning of the 4th, if he could, and so thrilled to see her there again. Yet, alas, as he also wrote now, so uncertain was he, even now, as to how he was to do, there were certain details in connection with his work here that might delay him a day or 2 or 3, he could not tell as yet, but would write her by the 2nd at the latest, when he would know positively. Yet saying to himself as he wrote this, if she but knew what those details were, if she but knew. Yet in penning this, and without having as yet answered the last importunate letter from Roberta, he was also saying to himself that this did not mean that he was planning to go to Roberta at all, or that if he did, it did not mean that he was going to attempt to kill her. Never once did he honestly, or to put it more accurately, forthrightly and courageously or coldly face the thought of committing so grim a crime. On the contrary, the nearer he approached a final resolution or the need for one in connection with all this, the more hideous and terrible seemed the idea, hideous and difficult, and hence the more improbable it seemed that he should ever commit it. It was true that from moment to moment, arguing with himself as he constantly was, sweating mental sweats and fleeing from moral and social terrors in connection with it all, he was thinking from time to time that he might go to Big Bittern in order to quiet her in connection with these present importunities and threats, and hence, once more evasion, tergiversation with himself, give himself more time in which to conclude what his true course must be. The way of the lake. The way of the lake. But once there, whether it would then be advisable so to do, or not, well, who could tell? He might even yet be able to convert Roberta to some other point of view. For, say what you would, she was certainly acting very unfairly and captiously in all this. She was, as he saw it in connection with his very vital dream of Sandra, making a mountain, an immense terror, out of a state that when all was said and done, was not so different from Esta's. And Esta had not compelled anyone to marry her. And how much better were the Aldens to his own parents, poor farmers as compared to poor preachers. And why should he be so concerned as to what they would think when Esta had not troubled to think what her parents would feel? In spite of all that Roberta had said about blame, was she so entirely lacking in blame herself? To be sure, he had sought to entice or seduce her, as you will, but even so, could she be held entirely blameless? Could she not have refused, if she was so positive at the time that she was so very moral? But she had not. And as to all this, all that he had he not done all he could to help her out of it? And he had so little money, too. and was placed in such a difficult position. She was just as much to blame as he was. And yet now she was so determined to drive him this way. To insist on his marrying her, whereas if she would only go her own way, as she could with his help, she might still save both of them all this trouble. But no, she would not, and he would not marry her, and that was all there was to it. She need not think that she could make him. No, no, no. At times, when in such moods, he felt that he could do anything, drown her easily enough, and she would only have herself to blame. Then again his more cowering sense of what society would think and do, if it knew, what he himself would be compelled to think of himself afterwards, fairly well satisfied him that as much as he desired to stay, he was not the one to do anything at all and in consequence must flee. And so it was that Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday following Roberta's letter received on Monday, had passed. And then, on Thursday night, following a most torturesome mental day on his and Roberta's part for that matter, this is what he received: Belts, Wednesday, June 30th. Dear Clyde, this is to tell you that unless I hear from you either by telephone or letter before noon, Friday, I shall be in Lycurgus that same night, and the world will know how you have treated me. I cannot and will not wait and suffer one more hour. I regret to be compelled to take this step, but you have allowed all this time to go in silence really, and Saturday is the 3rd, and without any plans of any kind. My whole life is ruined and so will yours be in a measure, but I cannot feel that I am entirely to blame. I have done all I possibly could to make this burden as easy for you as possible, and I certainly regret all the misery it will cause my parents and friends and all whom you know and hold dear. But I will not wait and suffer 1 hour more. Roberta. And with this in his hands, he was finally all but numbed by the fact that now decidedly he must act. She was actually coming. Unless he could soothe or restrain her in some manner, she would be here tomorrow, the 2nd. And yet the 2nd, or the 3rd, or any time until after the 4th, was no time to leave with her. The holiday crowds would be too great. There would be too many people to see, to encounter. There must be more secrecy. He must have at least a little more time in which to get ready. He must think now quickly and then act. Great God! Get ready. Could he not telephone her and say that he had been sick or so worried on account of the necessary money or something that he could not write, and that besides his uncle had sent for him to come to Greenwood Lake over the 4th? His uncle. His uncle. No, that would not do. He had used his name too much. What difference should it make to him or her now, whether he saw his uncle once more or not? He was leaving once and for all, or so he had been telling her, on her account, was he not? And so he had better say that he was going to his uncle, in order to give a reason why he was going away, so that, possibly, he might be able to return in a year or so. She might believe that. At any rate he must tell her something that would quiet her until after the 4th. Make her stay up there until at least he could perfect some plan, bring himself to the place where he could do one thing or the other. One thing or the other. Without pausing to plan anything more than just this at this time, he hurried to the nearest telephone where he was least likely to be overheard. And, getting her once more, began one of those long and evasive and, in this instance, ingratiating explanations which eventually, after he had insisted that he had actually been sick, confined to his room with a fever and hence not able to get to a telephone, and because, as he now said, he had finally decided that it would be best if he were to make some explanation to his uncle, so that he might return some time in the future, if necessary, he, by using the most pleading, if not actually affectionate, tones and asking her to consider what a state he had been in, too, was able not only to make her believe that there was some excuse for his delay and silence, but also to introduce the plan that he now had in mind, which was if only she could wait until the 6th, then assuredly, without fail as to any particular, he would meet her at any place she would choose to come, Homer, Fonda, Lycurgus, Little Falls, only since they were trying to keep everything so secret, he would suggest that she come to Fonda on the morning of the 6th in order to make the noon train for Utica. There they could spend the night since they could not very well discuss and decide on their plans over the telephone, now, and then they could act upon whatever they had decided. Besides, he could tell her better than just how he thought they ought to do. He had an idea, a little trip maybe, somewhere before they got married or after, just as she wished, but, something nice anyhow. His voice grew husky and his knees and hands shook slightly as he said this, only Roberta could not detect the sudden perturbation within him. But she must not ask him now. He could not tell her over the phone. But as sure as anything, at noon on the 6th, he would be on the station platform at Fonda. All she had to do after seeing him was to buy her ticket to Utica and get in one coach, and he would buy his separately and get in another, the one just ahead or behind hers. On the way down, if she didn't see him at the station beforehand, he would pass through her car for a drink so that she could see that he was there, no more than that, but she mustn't speak to him. Then once in Utica, she should check her bag and he would follow her out to the nearest quiet corner. After that he would go and get her bag, and then they could go to some little hotel and he would take care of all the rest. But she must do this. Would she have that much faith in him? If so, he would call her up on the 3rd, the very next day, and on the morning of the 6th, sure, so that both he and she would know that everything was all right, that she was starting and that he would be there. What was that? Her trunk? The little one? Sure. If she needed it, certainly bring it. Only, if he were she, he would not trouble to try to bring too much now, because once she was settled somewhere, it would be easy enough to send for anything else that she really needed. As Clyde stood at the telephone in a small outlying drugstore and talked, the lonely proprietor buried in a silly romance among his pots and files at the back, it seemed as though the giant effort that had previously materialized in the silent halls of his brain, was once more here at his elbow, that he himself, cold and numb and fearsome, was being talked through, not actually talking himself. Go to the lake which you visited with Sandra. Get travel folders of the region there from either the Lycurgus house here or the depot. Go to the south end of it and from there walk south, afterwards. Pick a boat that will upset easily, one with a round bottom, such as those you have seen here at Crown Lake and up there. Buy a new and different hat and leave that on the water, one that cannot be traced to you. You might even tear the lining out of it so that it cannot be traced. Pack all of your things in your trunk here, but leave it, so that swiftly, in the event that anything goes wrong, you can return here and get it and depart. And take only such things with you as will make it seem as though you were going for an outing to 12th Lake, not away, so that should you be sought at 12th Lake, it will look as though you had gone only there, not elsewhere. Tell her that you intend to marry her, but after you return from this outing, not before. And if necessary strike a light blow, so as to stun her, no more, so that falling in the water, she will drown the more easily. Do not fear. Do not be weak. Walk through the woods by night, not by day, so that when seen again you will be in 3 Mile Bay or Sharon, and can say that you came from Racket or Long Lake South, or from Lycurgus North. Use a false name and alter your handwriting as much as possible. Assume that you will be successful. And whisper, whisper, let your language be soft, your tone tender, loving, even. It must be, if you are to win her to your will now. So the effort of his own darker self. Chapter 46. And then at noon on Tuesday, July 6, the station platform of the railroad running from Fonda to Utica, with Roberta stepping down from the train which came south from Biltz to await Clyde, for the train that was to take them to Utica was not due for another half hour. And 15 minutes later Clyde himself coming from a side street and approaching the station from the south, from which position Roberta could not see him but from where, after turning the west corner of the depot and stationing himself behind a pile of grates, he could see her. How thin and pale indeed! By contrast with Sandra, how illy dressed in the blue traveling suit and small brown hat with which she had equipped herself for this occasion, the promise of a restricted and difficult life as contrasted with that offered by Sandra. And she was thinking of compelling him to give up Sandra in order to marry her, and from which union he might never be able to extricate himself until such time as would make Sandra and all she represented a mere recollection. The difference between the attitudes of these two girls, Sandra with everything offering all, asking nothing of him, Roberta, with nothing, asking all. A feeling of dark and bitter resentment swept over him, and he could not help but feel sympathetic toward that unknown man at Pass Lake and secretly wish that he had been successful. Perhaps he, too, had been confronted by a situation just like this. And perhaps he had done right, too, after all, and that was why it had not been found out. His nerves twitched. His eyes were somber, resentful and yet nervous. Could it not happen again successfully in this case? But here he was now upon the same platform with her as the result of her persistent and illogical demands, and he must be thinking how, and boldly, he must carry out the plans which, for 4 days, or ever since he had telephoned her, and in a dimmer way for the 10 preceding those, he had been planning. This settled course must not be interfered with now. He must act. He must not let fear influence him to anything less than he had now planned. And so it was that he now stepped forth in order that she might see him, at the same time giving her a wise and seemingly friendly and informative look as if to say, "You see, I am here." But behind the look, if only she could have pierced beneath the surface and sensed that dark and tortured mood, how speedily she would have fled. But now seeing him actually present, a heavy shadow that was lurking in her eyes lifted, the somewhat downturned corners of her mouth reversed themselves, and without appearing to recognize him, she nevertheless brightened and at once proceeded to the window to purchase her ticket to Utica, as he had instructed her to do. And she was now thinking that at last he had come. And he was going to take her away. And hence a kind of gratefulness for this welling up in her. For they were to be together for 7 or 8 months at the least. And while it might take tact and patience to adjust things, still it might and probably could be done. From now on she must be the very soul of caution, not do or say anything that would irritate him in any way, since naturally he would not be in the best mood because of this. But he must have changed some, perhaps he was seeing her in a more kindly light, sympathizing with her a little, since he now appeared at last to have most gracefully and genially succumbed to the unavoidable. And at the same time noting his light gray suit, his new straw hat, his brightly polished shoes and the dark tan suitcase and, strange, equivocal, frivolous erraticism of his in this instance, the tripod of a recently purchased camera together with his tennis racket in its canvas case strapped to the side, more than anything to conceal the initial C. G. She was seized with much of her old-time mood and desire in regard to his looks and temperament. He was still, and despite his present indifference to her, her Clyde. Having seen her secure her ticket, he now went to get his own, and then, with another knowing look in her direction, which said that everything was now all right, he returned to the eastern end of the platform, while she returned to her position at the forward end. Why was that old man in that old brown winter suit and hat and carrying that bird cage in a brown paper looking at him so? Could he sense anything? Did he know him? Had he ever worked in Lycurgus or seen him before? He was going to buy a second straw hat in Utica today, he must remember that, a straw hat with a Utica label, which he would wear instead of his present one. Then, when she was not looking, he would put the old one in his bag with his other things. That was why he would have to leave her for a little while after they reached Utica, at the depot or library or somewhere, perhaps as was his first plan, take her to some small hotel somewhere and register as Mr. and Mrs. Carl Granmore Clifford Golden or Gehring. There was a girl in the factory by that name, so if they were ever traced in any way, it would be assumed that she had gone away with some man of that name. That whistle of a train afar off. It must be coming now. His watch said 12:27, and again he must decide what his manner toward her in Utica must be, whether very cordial or the opposite. For over the telephone, of course, he had talked very soft and genial-like because he had to. Perhaps it would be best to keep that up, otherwise she might become angry or suspicious or stubborn and that would make it hard. Would that train never get here? At the same time, it was going to be very hard on him to be so very pleasant when, after all, she was driving him as she was, expecting him to do all that she was asking him to do and yet be nice to her. Damn. And yet if he were an apostrophe T question mark, supposing she should sense something of his thoughts in connection with this, really refuse to go through with it this way and spoil his plans. If only his knees and hands wouldn't tremble so at times, but no, how was she to be able to detect anything of that kind, when he himself had not quite made up his mind as to whether he would be able to go through with it or not? He only knew he was not going away with her, and that was all there was to that. He might not upset the boat, as he had decided on the day before, but just the same he was not going away with her. But here now was the train. And there was Roberta lifting her bag. Was it too heavy for her in her present state? It probably was. Well, too bad. It was very hot today, too. At any rate, he would help her with it later, when they were where no one could see them. She was looking toward him to be sure he was getting on, so like her these days, in her suspicious, doubtful mood in regard to him. But here was a seat in the rear of the car on the shady side, too. That was not so bad. He would settle himself comfortably and look out. For just outside Fonda, a mile or two beyond, was that same Mohawk that ran through Lycurgus and past the factory, and along the banks of which the year before, he and Roberta had walked about this time. But the memory of that being far from pleasant now, he turned his eyes to a paper he had bought, and behind which he could shield himself as much as possible, while he once more began to observe the details of the more inward scene which now so much more concerned him, the nature of the lake country around Big Bittern, which ever since that final important conversation with Roberta over the telephone, had been interesting him more than any other geography of the world. For on Friday, after the conversation, he had stopped in at the Lycurgus house and secured 3 different folders relating to hotels, lodges, inns and other camps in the more remote region beyond Big Bittern and Long Lake. If only there were some way to get to one of those completely deserted lakes described by that guide at Big Bittern, only, perhaps, there might not be any rowboats on any of these lakes at all, and again on Saturday, had he not secured 4 more circulars from the rack at the depot, they were in his pocket now. Had he not proved how many small lakes and inns there were along this same railroad, which ran north to Big Bittern, to which he and Roberta might resort for a day or two if she would, and night, anyhow, before going to Big Bittern and Grass Lake, had he not noted that in particular, a beautiful lake it had said, near the station, and with at least 3 attractive lodges or country home inns where 2 could stay for as low as $20 a week. That meant that 2 could stay for one night surely for as little as $5. It must be so surely, and so he was going to say to her, as he had already planned these several days, that she needed a little rest before going away to a strange place, that it would not cost very much, about $15 for fares and all, so the circulars said, if they went to Grass Lake for a night, this same night after reaching Utica, or on the morrow, anyhow. And he would have to picture it all to her as a sort of honeymoon journey, a little pleasant outing, before getting married. And it would not do to succumb to any plan of hers to get married before they did this, that would never do. Those 5 birds winging toward that patch of trees over there, below that hill, it certainly would not do to go direct to Big Bittern from Utica for a boat ride, just one day, 70 miles. That would not sound right to her, or to anyone. It would make her suspicious, maybe. It might be better, since he would have to get away from her to buy a hat in Utica, to spend this first night there at some inexpensive, inconspicuous hotel, and once there, suggest going up to Grass Lake. And from there they could go to Big Bittern in the morning. He could say that Big Bittern was nicer, or that they would go down to 3 Mile Bay, a hamlet really as he knew, where they could be married, but en route stop at Big Bittern as a sort of lark. He would say that he wanted to show her the lake, take some pictures of her and himself. He had brought his camera for that and for other pictures of Sandra later. The blackness of this plot of his. Those 9 black and white cows on that green hillside, but again, strapping that tripod along with his tennis racket to the side of his suitcase. Might not that cause people to imagine that they were passing tourists from some distant point? Maybe, and if they both disappeared, well, then, they were not people from anywhere around here, were they? Didn't the guide say that the water in the lake was all of 75 feet deep, like that water at Pass Lake? And as for Roberta's grip, oh, yes, what about that? He hadn't even thought about that as yet, really. Those 3 automobiles out there running almost as fast as this train, well, in coming down from Grass Lake after one night there, he could say that he was going to marry her at 3 Mile Bay at the north end of Gray's Lake, where a minister lived whom he had met. He would induce her to leave her bag at that gun lodge station, where they took the bus over to Big Bittern, while he took his with him. He could just say to someone, the boatman, maybe, or the driver, that he was taking his camera in his bag, and ask where the best views were. Or maybe a lunch. Was that not a better idea, to take a lunch and so deceive Roberta, too, perhaps? And that would tend to mislead the driver, also, would it not? People did carry cameras in bags when they went out on lakes, at times. At any rate, it was most necessary for him to carry his bag in this instance. Else why the plan to go south to that island and from thence through the woods? Oh, the grimness and the terror of this plan. Could he really execute it? But that strange cry of that bird at Big Bittern. He had not liked that, or seeing that guide up there who might remember him now. He had not talked to him at all, had not even gotten out of the car, but had only looked out at him through the window, and insofar as he could recall the guide had not even once looked at him, had merely talked to Grant Cranston and Harley Baggett, who had gotten out and had done all the talking. But supposing this guide should be there and remember him? But how could that be when he really had not seen him? This guide would probably not remember him at all, might not even be there. But why should his hands and face be damp all the time now, wet almost, and cold, his knees shaky? This train was following the exact curve of this stream, and last summer he and Roberta. But no, as soon as they reached Utica now this was the way he would do, and must keep it well in mind and not get rattled in any way. He must not, he must not. He must let her walk up the street before him, say 100 feet or so between them, so that no one would think he was following her, of course. And then when they were quite alone somewhere he would catch up with her and explain all about this, be very nice as though he cared for her as much as ever now, he would have to, if he were to get her to do as he wanted. And then, oh, yes, have her wait while he went for that extra straw hat that he was going to, well, leave on the water, maybe. And the oars, too, of course. And her hat, and, well, the long, sad-sounding whistle of this train. Damn. He was getting nervous already, but before going to the hotel, he must go back to the depot and put his new hat in the bag, or better yet, carry it while he looked for the sort of hotel he wanted, and then, before going to Roberta, take the hat and put it in his bag. Then he would go and find her and have her come to the entrance of the hotel he had found and wait for him, while he got the bags. And, of course, if there was no one around or very few, they would enter together, only she could wait in the ladies' parlor somewhere, while he went and registered as Charles Golden, maybe, this time. And then, well, in the morning, if she agreed, or tonight, for that matter, if there were any trains, he would have to find out about that. They could go up to Grass Lake in separate cars until they were past 12th Lake and Sharon, at any rate. The beautiful Cranston Lodge there and Sondra, and then, that big red barn and that small white house near it. And that windmill. So like those houses and barns that he had seen out there in Illinois and Missouri. And Chicago, too. And at the same time Roberta in her car forward thinking that Clyde had not appeared so very unfriendly to her. To be sure, it was hard on him, making him leave Lycurgus in this way, and when he might be enjoying himself as he wished to. But on the other hand, here was she, and there was no other way for her to be. She must be very genial and yet not put herself forward too much or in his way. And yet she must not be too receding or weak, either, for, after all, Clyde was the one who had placed her in this position. And it was only fair, and little enough for him to do. She would have a baby to look after in the future, and all that trouble to go through with from now on. And later, she would have to explain to her parents this whole mysterious proceeding, which covered her present disappearance and marriage, if Clyde really did marry her now. But she must insist upon that, and soon, in Utica, perhaps, certainly at the very next place they went to, and get a copy of her marriage certificate, too, and keep it for her own as well as the baby's sake. He could get a divorce as he pleased after that. She would still be Mrs. Griffiths. And Clyde's baby and hers would be a Griffiths, too. That was something. How beautiful the little river was. It reminded her of the Mohawk and the walks she and he had taken last summer when they first met. Oh, last summer. And now this, and they would settle somewhere, in 1 or 2 rooms, no doubt. Where, she wondered, in what town or city? How far away from Lycurgus or Biltz? The farther from Biltz the better, although she would like to see her mother and father again, and soon, as soon as she safely could. But what matter, as long as they were going away together and she was to be married? Had he noticed her blue suit and little brown hat? And had he thought she looked at all attractive compared to those rich girls with whom he was always running? She must be very tactful, not irritate him in any way. But, oh, the happy life they could have if only he cared for her a little, just a little. And then Utica, and on a quiet street Clyde catching up with Roberta, his expression a mixture of innocent geniality and goodwill, tempered by worry and opposition, which was really a mask for the fear of the deed that he himself was contemplating, his power to execute it, the consequences in case he failed. Chapter 47. And then, as planned that night between them, a trip to Grass Lake the next morning in separate cars, but which, upon their arrival and to his surprise, proved to be so much more briskly tenanted than he anticipated. He was very much disturbed and frightened by the evidence of so much active life up here. For he had fancied this, as well as Big Bittern, would be all but deserted. Yet here now, as both could see, it was the summer seat and gathering place of some small religious organization or group, the Winebrennerians of Pennsylvania, as it proved with a tabernacle and numerous cottages across the lake from the station. And Roberta at once exclaiming, "Now, there, isn't that cute? Why couldn't we be married over there by the minister of that church?" And Clyde, puzzled and shaken by this sudden and highly unsatisfactory development, at once announced, "Why, sure, I'll go over after a bit and see," yet his mind busy with schemes for circumventing her. He would take her out in a boat after registering and getting settled and remain too long. Or should a peculiarly remote and unobserved spot be found? But no, there were too many people here. The lake was not large enough, and probably not very deep. It was black or dark like tar, and sentineled to the east and north by tall, dark pines, the serried spears of armed and watchful giants, as they now seemed to him, ogres almost. So gloomy, suspicious and fantastically erratic was his own mood in regard to all this. But still there were too many people, as many as 10 on the lake. The weirdness of it. The difficulty. But one could not walk from here through any woods to 3 Mile Bay. Oh, no. That was all of 30 miles to the south now. And besides, this lake was less lonely, probably continually observed by members of this religious group. Oh, no, he must say, but what could he say? That he had inquired, and that no license could be procured here? Or that the minister was away, or that he required certain identifications which he did not have, or, well, anything that would serve to still Roberta until such hour tomorrow, as the train south from here left for Big Bittern and Sharon, where, of course, they would surely be married. Why should she be so insistent? And why, anyhow, and except for her crass determination to force him in this way, should he be compelled to track here and there with her, every hour, every minute of which was torture, an unending mental crucifixion really? If he were but rid of her. Oh, Sandra, Sandra, if but now from your high estate, you might bend down and aid me. No more lies. No more suffering. No more misery of any kind. But instead, more lies. A long and aimless and pestilential search for water lilies, which because of his own restless mood, bored Roberta as much as it did him. For why, she was now thinking to herself as they rode about, this indifference to this marriage possibility, which could have been arranged before now and given this outing the dream quality it would and should have had, if only he had arranged for everything in Utica, even as she had wanted. But this waiting, evasion, and so like Clyde, his vacillating, indefinite, uncertain mood, always. She was beginning to wonder now as to his intentions again, whether really and truly he did intend to marry her as he had promised. Tomorrow, or the next day at most, would show. So why worry now? And then the next day at noon, Gun Lodge and Big Bittern itself and Clyde climbing down from the train at Gun Lodge and escorting Roberta to the waiting bus, the while he assured her that since they were coming back this way, it would be best if she were to leave her bag here, while he, because of his camera as well as the lunch done up at Grass Lake and crowded into his suitcase, would take his own with him, because they would lunch on the lake. But on reaching the bus, he was dismayed by the fact that the driver was the same guide whom he had heard talk at Big Bittern. What if it should prove now that this guide had seen and remembered him? Would he not at least recall the handsome Finchley car, Bertine and Stuart on the front seat, himself and Sandra at the back, Grant and that Harley Baggett talking to him outside? At once that cold perspiration that had marked his more nervous and terrified moods for weeks past, now burst forth on his face and hands. Of what had he been thinking, anyhow? How planning? In God's name, how expect to carry a thing like this through, if he were going to think so poorly? It was like his failing to wear his cap from Lycurgus to Utica, or at least getting it out of his bag before he tried to buy that straw hat. It was like not buying the straw hat before he went to Utica at all. Yet the guide did not remember him, thank God. On the contrary, he inquired rather curiously, and as of a total stranger, "Goin' over to the lodge at Big Bittern? First time up here?" And Clyde, enormously relieved and yet really tremulous, replied, "Yes," and then in his nervous excitement asked, "Many people over there today?" A question which the moment he had propounded it, seemed almost insane. Why, of all questions, should he ask that? Oh, God, would his silly, self-destructive mistakes never cease? So troubled was he indeed, now, that he scarcely heard the guide's reply, or, if at all, as a voice speaking from a long way off. "Not so many. About 7 or 8, I guess. We did have about 30 over the 4th, but most of them went down yesterday." The stillness of these pines lining this damp yellow road along which they were traveling, the cool and the silence, the dark shadows and purple and gray depths and nooks in them, even at high noon. If one were slipping away at night or by day, who would encounter one here? A blue jay far in the depths somewhere uttered its metallic shriek, a field sparrow, tremulous upon some distant twig, filled the silver shadows with its perfect song. And Roberta, as this heavy, covered bus crossed rill and thin stream, and then rough wooden bridges here and there, commented on the clarity and sparkle of the water. "Isn't that wonderful in there? Do you hear the tinkling of that water, Clyde? Oh, the freshness of this air!" And yet she was going to die so soon. God! But supposing now, at Big Bittern, the lodge and boathouse there were many people. Or that the lake, peradventure, was literally dotted with those that were there, all fishermen and all fishing here and there, each one separate and alone, no privacy or a deserted spot anywhere. And how strange he had not thought of that. This lake was probably not nearly as deserted as he had imagined, or would not be today, any more than Grass Lake had proved. And then what? Well, flight then, flight, and let it go at that. This strain was too much, hell. He would die, thinking thoughts like these. How could he have dreamed to better his fortunes by any so wild and brutal a scheme as this anyhow, to kill and then run away, Or rather to kill and pretend that he and she had drowned, while he, the real murderer, slipped away to life and happiness. What a horrible plan. And yet how else? How? Had he not come all this way to do this? And was he going to turn back now? And all this time Roberta at his side was imagining that she was not going to anything but marriage, tomorrow morning sure, and now only to the passing pleasure of seeing this beautiful lake of which he had been talking, as though it were something more important and delectable than any that had as yet been in her or his life for that matter. But now the guide was speaking again, and to him, "You're not mine to stay over, I suppose. I see you left the young lady's bag over there." He nodded in the direction of Gun Lodge. "No, we're going on down tonight, on that 8:10. You take people over to that?" "Oh, sure. They said you did, at Grass Lake." But now why should he have added that reference to Grass Lake, for that showed that he and Roberta had been there before coming here. But this fool with his reference to the young lady's bag. And leaving it at Gun Lodge. The devil. Why shouldn't he mind his own business? Or why should he have decided that he and Roberta were not married? Or had he so decided? At any rate, why such a question when they were carrying 2 bags and he had brought one? Strange. The effrontery. How should he know or guess or what? But what harm could it do, married or unmarried? If she were not found, married or unmarried would make no difference, would it? And if she were, and it was discovered that she was not married, would that not prove that she was off with someone else? Of course. So why worry over that now? And Roberta asking, "Are there any hotels or boarding houses on the lake besides this one we're going to?" "Not the one, miss, outside of the inn that we're going to. There was a crowd of young fellers and girls campin' over on the east shore, yesterday, I believe, about a mile from the inn, but whether they're there now or not, I dunno. Ain't seen none of 'em today. A crowd of young fellows and girls. For God's sake. And might not they now be out on the water, all of them, rowing, or sailing, or what? And he here with her. Maybe some of them from 12th Lake. Just as he and Sandra and Harriet and Stuart and Bertine had come up 2 weeks before, some of them friends of the Cranstons, Harriets, Finchleys or others who had come up here to play and who would remember him, of course. And again, then, there must be a road to the east of this lake. And all this knowledge and their presence there now might make this trip of his useless. Such silly plotting. Such pointless planning as this, when at least he might have taken more time, chosen a lake still farther away and should have, only so tortured had he been for these last many days, that he could scarcely think how to think. Well, all he could do now was to go and see. If there were many he must think of some way to row to some real lonely spot or maybe turn and return to Grass Lake, or where. Oh, what could or would he do, if there were many over here? But just then a long aisle of green trees giving out at the far end as he now recalled upon a square of lawn, and the lake itself, the little inn with its pillared veranda, facing the dark blue waters of Big Bittern, and that low, small red-roofed boathouse to the right on the water that he had seen before when he was here. And Roberta exclaiming on sight, "Oh, it is pretty, isn't it, just beautiful." And Clyde surveying that dark, low island in the distance, to the south, and seeing but few people about, none on the lake itself, exclaiming nervously, "Yes, it is, you bet." But feeling half choked as he said it. And now the host of the inn himself appearing and approaching, a medium-sized, red-faced, broad-shouldered man who was saying most intriguingly, "Staying over for a few days?" But Clyde, irritated by this new development and after paying the guide $1, replying crustily and irritably, "No, no, just came over for the afternoon. We're going on down tonight." "You'll be staying over for dinner then, I suppose? The train doesn't leave till 8:15. "Oh, yes, that's so. Sure. Yes, well, in that case, we will." For, of course, Roberta on her honeymoon, the day before her wedding and on a trip like this, would be expecting her dinner. Damn this stocky, red-faced fool, anyway. Well, then, I'll just take your bag and you can register. Your wife will probably be wanting to freshen up a bit anyway." He led the way, bag in hand, although Clyde's greatest desire was to snatch it from him. For he had not expected to register here, nor leave his bag either. And would not. He would recapture it and hire a boat. But on top of that, being compelled for the register's sake, as Boniface phrased it, to sign Clifford Golden and wife, before he could take his bag again. And then to add to the nervousness and confusion engendered by all this, thoughts as to what additional developments or persons, even, he might encounter before leaving on his climacteric errand, Roberta announcing that because of the heat and the fact that they were coming back to dinner, she would leave her hat and coat, a hat in which he had already seen the label of Bronstein in Lycurgus, and which at the time caused him to meditate as to the wisdom of leaving or extracting it. But he had decided that perhaps afterwards, if he should really do this, it might not make any difference whether it was there, or not. Was she not likely to be identified anyhow, if found, and if not found, who was to know who she was? In a confused and turbulent state mentally, scarcely realizing the clarity or import of any particular thought or movement or act now, he took up his bag and led the way to the boathouse platform. And then, after dropping the bag into the boat, asking of the boathouse keeper if he knew where the best views were, that he wanted to photograph them. And this done, the meaningless explanation over, assisting Roberta, an almost nebulous figure, she now seemed, stepping down into an insubstantial rowboat upon a purely ideational lake, he now stepped in after her, seating himself in the center and taking the oars. The quiet, glassy, iridescent surface of this lake that now to both seemed, not so much like water as oil, like molten glass that, of enormous bulk and weight, resting upon the substantial earth so very far below. And the lightness and freshness and intoxication of the gentle air blowing here and there, yet scarcely rippling the surface of the lake. And the softness and furry thickness of the tall pines about the shore. Everywhere pines, tall and spur-like. And above them the humped backs of the dark and distant Adirondacks beyond. Not a rower to be seen. Not a house or cabin. He sought to distinguish the camp of which the guide had spoken. He could not. He sought to distinguish the voices of those who might be there, or any voices. Yet, except for the lock of his own oars as he rowed and the voice of the boathouse keeper and the guide in converse 200, 300, 500, 1,000 feet behind, there was no sound. Isn't it still and peaceful? It was Roberta talking. It seems to be so restful here. I think it's beautiful, truly, so much more beautiful than that other lake. These trees are so tall, aren't they? And those mountains. I was thinking all the way over how cool and silent that road was, even if it was a little rough. Did you talk to anyone in the inn there just now? Why, no, what makes you ask? Oh, I thought you might have run into someone. There don't seem to be very many people up here today, though, does there? No, I don't see anyone on the lake. I saw 2 men in that billiard room at the back there, and there was a girl in the ladies' room, that was all. Isn't this water cold? She had put her hand over the side and was trailing it in the blue-black ripples made by his oars. Is it? I haven't felt it yet. He paused in his rowing and put out his hand, then resumed. He would not row directly to that island to the south. It was too far, too early. She might think it odd. Better a little delay. A little time in which to think, a little while in which to reconnoiter. Roberta would be wanting to eat her lunch, and there was a charming-looking point of land there to the west about a mile further on. They could go there and eat first, or she could, for he would not be eating today. And then, she was looking at the very same point of land that he was. A curved horn of land that bent to the south and yet reached quite far out into the water and combed with tall pines. And now she added, have you any spot in mind, dear, where we could stop and eat? I'm getting a little hungry, aren't you? If she would only not call him dear, here and now, the little inn and the boathouse to the north were growing momentarily smaller, looking now, like that other boathouse and pavilion on Crum Lake the day he had first rowed there, and when he had been wishing that he might come to such a lake as this in the Adirondacks, dreaming of such a lake, and wishing to meet such a girl as Roberta, then, and overhead was one of those identical woolly clouds that had sailed above him at Crum Lake on that fateful day. The horror of this effort! They might look for water lilies here today to kill time a little, before, to kill time. To kill, God, he must quit thinking of that, if he were going to do it at all. He needn't be thinking of it now, at any rate. At the point of land favored by Roberta, into a minute-protected bay with a small, turved, honey-colored beach, and safe from all prying eyes north or east. And then he and she stepping out normally enough. And Roberta, after Clyde had extracted the lunch most cautiously from his bag, spreading it on a newspaper on the shore, while he walked here and there, making strained and yet admiring comments on the beauty of the scene, the pines and the curve of this small bay, yet thinking of the island farther on and the bay below that again somewhere, where somehow, and in the face of a weakening courage for it, he must still execute this grim and terrible business before him, not allow this carefully planned opportunity to go for nothing, if he were to not really run away and leave all that he most desired to keep. And yet the horror of this business and the danger, now that it was so close at hand, the danger of making a mistake of some kind, if nothing more, of not upsetting the boat right, of not being able to, oh, God! And subsequently, maybe, to be proved to be what he would be, then, a murderer. Arrested. Tried. He would not, go through with it. No, and yet Roberta, sitting here with him now on the sand, feeling quite at peace with all the world as he could see. And she was beginning to hum a little, and then to make advisory and practical references to the nature of their coming adventure together, their material and financial state from now on, how and where they would go from here, Syracuse, most likely, since Clyde seemed to have no objection to that, and what, once there, they would do. For Roberta had heard from her brother-in-law, Fred Gabelle, of a new collar and shirt factory that was just starting up in Syracuse. Might it not be possible for Clyde, for the time being at least, to get himself a position with that firm at once? And then later, when her own worst trouble was over, might not she connect herself with the same company, or some other? And temporarily, since they had so little money, could they not take a small room together, somewhere in some family home, or if he did not like that, since they were by no means so close temperamentally as they once had been, then 2 small adjoining rooms, maybe. She could still feel his unrelenting opposition under all this present show of courtesy and consideration. And he thinking, oh, well, what difference such talk now? And whether he agreed or whether he did not. What difference since he was not going, or she either, that way? Great God! But here he was talking as though tomorrow she would be here still. And she would not be. If only his knees would not tremble so, his hands and face and body continue so damp. And after that, farther on down the west shore of this small lake in this little boat, to that island, with Clyde looking nervously and wearily here and there to see that there was no one, not anywhere in sight on land or water, no one. It was so still and deserted here, thank God. Here, or anywhere near here might do, really, if only he had the courage so to do now, which he had not, yet. Roberta trailing her hand in the water, asking him if he thought they might find some water lilies or wildflowers somewhere on shore. Water lilies. Wildflowers. And he convincing himself as he went that there were no roads, cabins, tents, paths, anything in the form of a habitation among these tall, close, ranking pines, no trace of any little boat on the widespread surface of this beautiful lake on this beautiful day. Yet might there not be some lone, solitary hunter and trapper or guide or fisherman in these woods or along these banks? Might there not be? And supposing there were one here now somewhere? And watching? Fate. Destruction. Death. Yet no sound and no smoke. Only, these tall, dark, green pines, spear-shaped and still, with here and there a dead one, ashen pale in the hard afternoon sun, its gaunt, sapless arms almost menacingly outstretched. Death. And the sharp metallic cry of a blue jay speeding in the depths of these woods. Or the lone and ghostly tap-tap-tap of some solitary woodpecker, with now and then the red line of a flying tanager, the yellow and black of a yellow-shouldered blackbird. Oh, the sun shines bright in my old Kentucky home. It was Roberta singing cheerfully, one hand in the deep blue water. And then a little later, I'll be there Sunday if you will, one of the popular dance pieces of the day. And then at last, after fully an hour of rowing, brooding, singing, stopping to look at some charming point of land, reconnoitering some receding inlet which promised water lilies, and with Roberta already saying that they must watch the time and not stay out too long. The bay, south of the island itself, a beautiful and yet most funereally pine-encircled and land-delimited bit of water, more like a smaller lake, connected by an inlet or passage to the larger one, and yet itself a respectable body of water of perhaps 20 acres of surface and almost circular in form. The manner in which to the east, the north, the south, the west, even, except for the passage by which the island to the north of it was separated from the mainland, this pool or tarn was encircled by trees. And cattails and water lilies here and there, a few along its shores. And somehow suggesting an especially arranged pool or tarn to which one who was weary of life and cares, anxious to be away from the strife and contentions of the world, might most wisely and yet gloomily repair. And as they glided into this still dark waters seemed to grip Clyde as nothing here or anywhere before this ever had, to change his mood. For once here he seemed to be fairly pulled or lured along into it, and having encircled its quiet banks, to be drifting, in endless space where was no end of anything, no plots, no plans, no practical problems to be solved, nothing. The insidious beauty of this place. Truly, it seemed to mock him, this strangeness, this dark pool, surrounded on all sides by those wonderful, soft, fir trees. And the water itself looking like a huge, black pearl cast by some mighty hand, in anger possibly, in sport or fantasy maybe, into the bosom of this valley of dark, green blush, and which seemed bottomless as he gazed into it. And yet, what did it all suggest so strongly? Death. Death. More definitely than anything he had ever seen before. Death. But also a still, quiet, unprotesting type of death into which one, by reason of choice or hypnosis or unutterable weariness, might joyfully and gratefully sink. So quiet, so shaded, so serene. Even Roberta exclaimed over this. And he now felt for the first time the grip of some seemingly strong, and yet friendly sympathetic, hands laid firmly on his shoulders. The comfort of them. The warmth. The strength. For now they seemed to have a steadying effect on him and he liked them, their reassurance, their support. If only they would not be removed. If only they would remain always, the hands of this friend. For where had he ever known this comforting and almost tender sensation before in all his life? Not anywhere, and somehow this calmed him and he seemed to slip away from the reality of all things. To be sure, there was Roberta over there, but by now she had faded to a shadow or thought really, a form of illusion more vaporous than real. And while there was something about her in color, form that suggested reality, still she was very insubstantial, so very, and once more now he felt strangely alone. For the hands of the friend of firm grip had vanished also. And Clyde was alone, so very much alone and forlorn, in this somber, beautiful realm to which apparently he had been led, and then deserted. Also he felt strangely cold, the spell of this strange beauty overwhelming him with a kind of chill. He had come here for what? And he must do what? Kill Roberta? Oh, no. And again he lowered his head and gazed into the fascinating and yet treacherous depths of that magnetic, bluish, purple pool, which, as he continued to gaze, seemed to change its form kaleidoscopically to a large, crystalline ball. But what was that moving about in this crystal? A form. It came nearer, clearer, and as it did so, he recognized Roberta struggling and waving her thin white arms out of the water and reaching toward him. God! How terrible! The expression on her face. What in God's name was he thinking of anyway? Death? Murder? And suddenly becoming conscious that his courage, on which he had counted so much this long while to sustain him here, was leaving him, and he instantly and consciously plumbing the depths of his being in a vain search to recapture it. Kit, 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 Caaa. Kit, 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 Caaa. Kit, 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 Caaa. The weird, haunting cry of that unearthly bird again. So cold, so harsh. Here it was once more to startle him out of his soul flight into a realization of the real or unreal immediate problem with all of its torturesome angles that lay before him. He must face this thing. He must. Kit, 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 Caaa. Kit, 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 Caaa. What was it sounding? A warning, a protest, condemnation? The same bird that had marked the very birth of this miserable plan. For there it was now upon that dead tree, that wretched bird. And now it was flying to another one, as dead, a little farther inland and crying as it did so. God! And then to the shore again in spite of himself. For Clyde, in order to justify his having brought his bag, now must suggest that pictures of this be taken, and of Roberta, and of himself, possibly, on land and water. For that would bring her into the boat again, without his bag, which would be safe and dry on land. And once on shore, actually pretending to be seeking out various special views here and there, while he fixed in his mind the exact tree at the base of which he might leave his bag against his return, which must be soon now, must be soon. They would not come on shore again together. Never. Never. And that in spite of Roberta protesting that she was getting tired, and did he not think they ought to be starting back pretty soon? It must be after 5, surely. And Clyde, assuring her that presently they would, after he had made 1 or 2 more pictures of her in the boat with those wonderful trees, that island and this dark water around and beneath her. His wet, damp, nervous hands. And his dark, liquid, nervous eyes, looking anywhere but at her. And then once more on the water again, about 500 feet from shore, the while he fumbled aimlessly with the hard and heavy and yet small camera that he now held, as the boat floated out nearer the center. And then, at this point and time looking fearfully about. For now, in spite of himself, the long-awaited and yet commanding moment. And no voice or figure or sound on shore. No road or cabin or smoke. And the moment which he or something had planned for him, and which was now to decide his fate at hand. The moment of action, of crisis. All that he needed to do now was to turn swiftly and savagely to one side or the other, leap up, upon the left whale or right and upset the boat, or, failing that, rock it swiftly, and if Roberta protested too much, strike her with the camera in his hand, or one of the oars at his right. It could be done. It could be done, swiftly and simply, were he now of the mind and heart, or lack of it, with him swimming swiftly away thereafter to freedom, to success, of course, to Sandra and happiness, a new and greater and sweeter life than any he had ever known. Yet why was he waiting now? What was the matter with him, anyhow? Why was he waiting? At this cataclysmic moment, and in the face of the utmost, the most urgent need of action. A sudden palsy of the will, of courage, of hate or rage sufficient, and with Roberta from her seat in the stern of the boat gazing at his troubled and then suddenly distorted and fulgurous, yet weak and even unbalanced face, a face of a sudden, instead of angry, ferocious, demoniac, confused and all but meaningless in its registration of a balanced combat between fear, a chemic revulsion against death or a murderous brutality that would bring death. And a harried and restless and yet self-repressed desire to do, yet temporarily unbreakable here and now, a static between a powerful compulsion to do and yet not to do. And in the meantime his eyes, the pupils of the same growing momentarily larger and more lurid, his face and body and hands tense and contracted, the stillness of his position, the balanced immobility of the mood more and more ominous, yet in truth not suggesting a brutal, courageous power to destroy, but the imminence of trance or spasm. And Roberta, suddenly noticing the strangeness of it all, the something of eerie unreason or physical and mental indetermination so strangely and painfully contrasting with this scene, exclaiming, "Why, Clyde! Clyde! What is it? Whatever is the matter with you anyhow? You look so strange, why, I never saw you look like this before. What is it?" And suddenly rising, or rather leaning forward, and by crawling along the even keel, attempting to approach him, since he looked as though he was about to fall forward into the boat, or to one side and out into the water. And Clyde, as instantly sensing the profoundness of his own failure, his own cowardice or inadequateness for such an occasion, as instantly yielding to a tide of submerged hate, not only for himself, but Roberta, her power, or that of life to restrain him in this way. And yet fearing to act in any way, being unwilling to, being willing only to say that never, never would he marry her, that never, even should she expose him, would he leave here with her to marry her, that he was in love with Sandra and would cling only to her, and yet not being able to say that even. But angry and confused and glowering. And then, as she drew near him, seeking to take his hand in hers and the camera from him in order to put it in the boat, he flinging out at her, but not even then with any intention to do other than free himself of her, her touch, her pleading, consoling sympathy, her presence forever, God. Yet, the camera still unconsciously held tight, pushing at her with so much vehemence as not only to strike her lips and nose and chin with it, but to throw her back sidewise toward the left whale, which caused the boat to careen to the very water's edge. And then he, stirred by her sharp scream, as much due to the lurch of the boat, as the cut on her nose and lip, rising and reaching half to assist or recapture her and half to apologize for the unintended blow, yet in so doing completely capsizing the boat, himself and Roberta being as instantly thrown into the water. And the left whale of the boat as it turned, striking Roberta on the head as she sank and then rose for the first time, her frantic, contorted face turned to Clyde, who by now had righted himself. For she was stunned, horror-struck, unintelligible with pain and fear, her lifelong fear of water and drowning and the blow he had so accidentally and all but unconsciously administered. "Help! Help! Oh, my God, I'm drowning, I'm drowning! Help! Oh, my God! Clyde, Clyde!" And then the voice at his ear. "But this, is not this that which you have been thinking and wishing for this while, you in your great need? And behold! For despite your fear, your cowardice, this has been done for you. An accident, an unintentional blow on your part is now saving you the labor of what you sought, and yet did not have the courage to do. But will you now, and when you need not, since it is an accident, by going to her rescue, once more plunge yourself in the horror of that defeat and failure which has so tortured you and from which this now releases you? You might save her. But again you might not. For see how she strikes about. She is stunned. She herself is unable to save herself, and by her erratic terror, if you draw near her now, may bring about your own death also. But you desire to live. And her living will make your life not worthwhile from now on. Rest but a moment, a fraction of a minute. Wait, ignore the pity of that appeal. And then, but there. Behold. It is over. She is sinking now. You will never see her alive any more, ever. And there is your own hat upon the water, as you wished. And upon the boat, clinging to that tralloc of ale belonging to her. Leave it. Will it not show that this was an accident? And apart from that, nothing, a few ripples, the peace and solemnity of this wondrous scene. And then once more the voice of that weird, contemptuous, mocking, lonely bird. Kit, 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 Caa. Kit, 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 Caa. Kit, 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 Caa. The cry of that devilish bird upon that dead limb, the whir whir. And then Clyde, with the sound of Roberta's cries still in his ears, that last frantic, white, appealing look in her eyes, swimming heavily, gloomily and darkly to shore. And the thought that, after all, he had not really killed her. No, no. Thank God for that. He had not. And yet, stepping up on the nearby bank and shaking the water from his clothes, had he? Or, had he not? For had he not refused to go to her rescue, and when he might have saved her, and when the fault for casting her in the water, however accidentally, was so truly his? And yet, the dusk and silence of a closing day. A concealed spot in the depths of the same sheltering woods where alone and dripping, his dry bag near, Clyde stood, and by waiting, sought to dry himself. But in the interim, removing from the side of the bag the unused tripod of his camera and seeking an obscure, dead log farther in the woods, hiding it. Had anyone seen? Was anyone looking? Then returning and wondering as to the direction. He must go west and then south. He must not get turned about. But the repeated cry of that bird, harsh, nerve-shaking. And then the gloom, in spite of the summer stars. And a youth making his way through a dark, uninhabited wood, a dry straw hat upon his head, a bag in his hand, walking briskly and yet warily, south,